I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this morning, and that's Danièle. Danièle is a spatial designer, speculative designer, and public artist, fusing design elements with installation, sculptural form, and research. Her design practice works in the intersection of architecture, interiors, urban design, performance design, and fine arts. And as an Aboriginal designer, her work is grounded in her cultural and experiential heritage. Her work often considers the urban Aboriginal condition, the Indigenous experience of country, and contemporary Indigenous identities. Gaining her experience globally, she's lived in London, Paris, Barcelona, Vancouver, and Sydney. Welcome, Danièle.
Hi, Walawani Jindawan to everybody. I'm a Budawang woman of the Yuin Nation, and that's on the south coast of New South Wales. So this is a photo of the beach down on my country, which is on the south coast of New South Wales. And I'd like to start, of course, by acknowledging all elders, past, present, and emerging, and to express my gratitude for the teachings and knowledge that knowledge holders and elders and people who work with country and know culture have shared with me. It made a major difference to my PhD to have their input, and I named many of those people as co-authors and co-designers of my PhD because without their input, the PhD would never have existed. So you can go to the next slide. This is just a little map of New South Wales for those who don't know where I'm situated. I'm here on Gadigal lands, which is in Sydney, and I'm the Budawang down the south coast is where my mob are from. They were dispossessed around 150 years ago, and they took a boat and travelled up the coast to Gumbaynggirr country, which you can see is the second dot down. That movement was, I don't think, an unfamiliar movement. My mob have been moving up and down that coast for a very long time. I grew up mostly in Bundjalung country, which is the top dot. So there's a songline that exists all the way up and down the coast of New South Wales, and people and stories and knowledges have travelled that songline for a very long time. You can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk today a little bit about, actually, in a way, quite a small part of my PhD, but it turned into being a major impact. It turned into a major impact for my PhD because it changed everything about how the PhD was understood and why I did it like I did, and how I managed working with my family and extended kin networks and community. It came about as due to an experience that I had in actually a museum, and it turned into a collaborative work with my colleague Sophie Herbert, who works at UTS Library. She and I have a very lovely relationship. So when I had this unusual experience in the museum, I was able to speak to her and say, this weird thing happened, and I don't know what to make of that, but we have to do something. And she could see the opportunity in that. And she decided that there was a chance for us to develop a new way of referencing Indigenous materials because of the referencing system that UTS uses, which is the Harvard UTS system. Next slide, please. So this is it on the website now. It's live as of about a year or so ago. And the idea with this referencing is that Indigenous people are referenced in a different way than non-Indigenous people. The reason for developing it was so that even in the smallest point of referencing, identity and Indigenous authors are being acknowledged. at every moment. Like in a way, a lot of people wouldn't understand why referencing was a big deal for me, but it actually, as I'll explain later, impacted back into the PhD. You can go to the next slide. The idea is that not only is the nation or country or language group being referenced in the referencing system, so you can see there on the screen the referencing of APY lands, which is the location of where this author is from, or actually it's a creator of an artwork. But also, if you go to the next slide, you can see here that if we don't know where somebody's from, because often in colonial processes this wasn't recorded, instead of saying unknown, we've changed the language a little bit to unrecorded. This is because so often when Indigenous articles and objects were taken or removed or dug up from country, it was the person who dug it up or took it or removed it whose name is recorded, and not the people or the person or the country or even the group from which it comes. It's a small change in language, but the idea is that the language starts people to think a little bit differently about how these colonial processes have impacted First Peoples, even in a small way of referencing. There's also, you can see in the referencing, we write ND instead of no date and C. That's fairly standard. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that there's ways of referencing non-Indigenous and Indigenous collaborations. And you can see there Jagamara has been referenced as being Warlpiri Luritja. You can go to the next slide. Just to the next one as well. Next slide as well. You can see how those changes are being impacted into the referencing system. Now, if you go to the next slide, I want to talk a bit about how that actually went into my PhD, because I was developing it as I was doing my PhD, so it effectively formed how certain parts of my PhD were being done. And the title is The Re-Indigenisation of Space, Weaving Narratives of Resistance to Embed Nura, Country in Design. Nura is the word for country in Darug language, which is the language my ancestors spoke. Next slide, please. You can go to the next slide, please. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. This is just a very brief abstract of my PhD. It's I won't read it out to you, but it just tells you about what I was looking at, which, as you can see, it wasn't really about referencing at all. It was looking at how Aboriginal people have always known, loved, dreamt, narrated, used, and occupied our spaces. And I wanted to readdress an unbalance that was happening, that I was reading, where there was non-Indigenous people speaking for Indigenous people about land, space and country. And I felt quite uncomfortable about that and wanted to address that unbalance. Of course, to do that, I had to find Indigenous people speaking about these things. And this regularly meant not being in my own discipline, because it's a discipline with a dearth of information. And also it meant that I was recording people's voices rather than using traditional sources of academic sources, like written sources. So, and that changed how I did even things like the literature review, which I had a problem with even in itself. But to move on to the next slide. This is a bit of a map of my PhD, just so you can see how I was understanding it from a spatial perspective. And you can see here that it sort of moves from stage 1 over to stage 3, so left to right. I'm not sure if that's on your screen the same. But you can see very early on, community were important to my PhD, as was being on country, being with elders. You can see the elders in the picture at the top. And my family were key to my PhD as well. Cultural practice came into it, and cultural stories and yarning, which is a culturally appropriate way of communicating with the Aboriginal people. So within this, if you go to the next slide, cultural practice became really important. And this is a little rhyme that I'm just going to share with you, out to country, back to the sea, which you can use while we're, for instance, weaving, which is the way that my family experience or work with culture in terms of our reclaiming practice. And this is talking about a way of remembering how to do a particular type of weave, out to country, back to the sea, because my family have strong relationships to the sea. We're saltwater people, which means effectively we need to be places where we can rust. So you can go to the next slide. But this is how the referencing started to come into my PhD. As I've mentioned, I called the people who were sharing with me, who were part of my community, my extended kin, and my family, my direct family. I called them co-authors and co-designers. And it felt more appropriate to me than calling them participants or informants. It didn't feel like, if I just called them an informant, I felt like I was disrespecting their knowledge and not acknowledging who they were to me and who they were to the research and the PhD. As you can see in the second little green box, I've actually just clipped this from my PhD, these things. And this is what I started to do. And poor Becky, when she was editing the chapter I wrote in the first Our Voices, I drove her crazy with this, but it was really important to me that not only were the people who I was referencing were acknowledged in the reference list at the end, but also in the footnotes. That meant that I spent a lot of time finding out about these people who I was referencing, and it became really important to me to make sure I did as best as I could to get that correct, and to acknowledge them all as First Peoples, and acknowledge that the knowledge didn't come from me, it came from them, and what I was saying came from a place. What they were saying came from a place. So I did my best to acknowledge how they identify themselves and where they came from or come from. So you can go to the next note. I then also, because as I mentioned, yarning was a very important part of my PhD, and I developed a new way of referencing yarning. And just to explain yarning a little bit, as I've mentioned, it's a culturally appropriate way of talking to Aboriginal people. And it's actually also, at least in Australia, a recognised method of research. And it's there are steps to it, and there are ways that you can do it in a respectful way, and it's important to do it in a respectful way. My grandmother, bless her, she's like an expert yarner without ever knowing that what she was doing was called yarning. And so I spent a lot of time with her throughout the PhD, understanding a lot of things from her. I learned a lot from her through the process, and understanding how she viewed the world and her particular viewpoint. and trying to make sure that actually the PhD spoke to my grandmother, which was challenging to say the least, because you're expected to use an academic language. And my grandmother, she left school at quite a young age because she wasn't given the opportunity to continue school. So I had to use a language that in the PhD that my grandmother could understand, or explain myself a lot. So I felt like by writing for my grandmother, I was writing for a lot of other people as well, because I was explaining a lot what I was talking about. If I used a big word, I'd always put in an explanation for it. If I used a language word, I'd always put in as best I could, a way of explaining what that meant in English. So this yarning became really important to my PhD because there was such a dearth of information from Aboriginal people talking about my topic. And so I needed to go out and find people to to share with me into the PhD what it meant to them to be part of this spatial paradigm that we're in, and how they understand country and those kind of questions. And I felt like just calling it an interview was disrespectful to that process. So I developed also a way of referencing yarning. And you can see that that's how it looks in the in-text. G. Nipris is my grandmother, and Gloria, and G. Sims is one of my elders, Uncle Greg. And so the final thing is, you can see how I've actually put these into my PhD, and you can see some of the references that include the yarns and their place of location, where we recorded that yarn, and what date. So it did change how I responded to a lot of things by doing this type of referencing. Next slide. This is, I'm just going to talk briefly as well, because as I mentioned earlier, the out to country, back to the sea comes back in here. The end result of my PhD was, or one of the results, was that I developed or named up, I prefer to call it, some methods of cultural and spatial practice. And these methods that I'm going to very, very, very briefly talk to you about, they are things that I've used in my practices without knowing I was using them until I examined them. And then I had to examine, of course, where they came from, and in terms of where they came from in me, so that I knew how to use them. And it came through, largely they came through my family, through extended kin networks, and people who were sharing with me in my PhD. These two works here are, they look like two different people have done those works, but actually I did them both, and I used very similar methods in both. And that's what I'm meaning, is that these methods were actually the grounding for the work, and they held, even though they have very different outcomes, the way that I did them was similar. So if you go to the next slide, these are the names, as I said, I called it naming up, and these are the names that I gave to these methods. And I'm still working through these a little bit because the work I'm doing elsewhere is asking how can architects and designers connect with country in order that they design more respectfully with country. And methods of practice and reconsidering how we actually work as designers and as researchers and as architects can inform, the methods of practice can inform that. And I guess I'm asking people to reconsider the processes that they use in order to do this design. So just to explain what this means, the resilience, resistance, relationality and reclamation, these were my ways of understanding decolonisation These were the words that I was choosing to engage with, amongst others, of course. And these words are related to narratives and stories that the co-designers and co-authors of the PhD shared with me throughout the course of the PhD. And so what I was trying to do was demonstrate how, in very small ways, particularly Aboriginal women, because that's the group I was wanting to work with, and in the end, their voices just became too loud for me to ignore, and their stories became too strong to ignore. So these were the ideas that were coming, or the themes that were coming through their stories. And so I related the stories and those narratives to the process or the methods. So the first one is a making yarning process. This is a method of using dialogue to lead practice. It's relating, of course, to yarning, which I've described a little bit about. But it's also asking you to make while you yarn. And what happens is that the conversation and the thought processes and the dialogue gets captured into whatever you're making. The next one, mapping through walking practice. This is a really important one because Aboriginal people have always walked country, firstly to move around, of course, but as much as anything, it's a process of caring for country. And that's a really important process, because that process of moving and through country helps you to understand and know country, and also hear what country is saying back to you. Storying, making knowledge. This is through sharing narratives. So it's partially to do with listening, really important. The storytelling process of First Peoples, at least for Aboriginal people, it's really important that you are not only listening to the story as a listener, but that the story is not being told in vain, if you get what I'm saying. So there's a reciprocal process to this sharing sharing of stories that both parties in the story-telling process, both the teller of the story and the hearer of the story, has. And it's more involved than what I've described, but it's basically that both parties need to be engaged in this reciprocal process in order that that the knowledge can be shared correctly, that the stories can be accessed in terms of their correct meaning, and that people are engaging with whatever level they're at in that story. So it's about this. So this is again a little bit about making, but also about learning how to listen in a different way, and particularly engaging with narratives. And then the final one, the responsive cultural practice. This is related, of course, to all the other ones. It's about how do we understand the signals of country and follow those signals. So it's in this one, I'm asking people to engage with different parts of their senses, not their sight, as much as what we seem to be quite engaged with sight as designers and architects and generally. But I'm asking people to understand that country it's not a one-way process with country, where we are just the ones giving all the messages. Country gives messages to us too, and we need to be receptive. And sometimes that receptive way of receiving isn't in what we see. And so it's asking people to sense in a different way that those ideas about, or the messages rather, that country is passing to us. There's a lot more involved in these, and as I said, these are just methods that I've I've been using them for a very long time, since I was quite young. But I had only just started to evaluate where I understood these from. And these were gifted to me through my family, through extended people in my kin networks, and I guess through experience and practice. But I don't claim them to be mine, which is why I say I named them up rather than I created them. the next screen, that's my grandmother. And I just wanted to say, Walawani Jindawan. This means safe travels, or what it actually means is I hope you had a safe journey here and I wish you a safe journey home. And that's from Dorriga, which is on the south coast. Thank you so much.
Kia ora, Danielle. You raised a number of really salient points to us as researchers. I can see across a number of the major research projects in Vision Mātauranga and National Science Challenge, and a lot of the community research we're engaged in, things like pūrākau, the storytelling is vital. I see cultural narrative really coming to the fore in terms of locating how our stories are shared, and to really emphasise that context is important. And we have phrases like tūranga waiwai, which is, knowing where you stand and the places you belong, and raising the importance of that relationship with Earth Mother, or Papatūānuku as we call her. So lots of insight there, and it's fabulous to hear that you've submitted and that you're on your way to becoming a doctor, and that you're also really creating space for us as Indigenous researchers to really acknowledge our knowing, our ways of knowing and being. Thank you for that. Now, Rebecca is a senior lecturer in environmental studies at Victoria University in Wellington. She has a PhD and MA in urban design from Oxford Brookes University, UK, and an undergraduate degree in politics and Māori studies. Interesting combination. She's the co-chair of Pōneke for Ngā Aho Network of Māori Designers and a panel member for the Auckland Urban Design Panel. Her research focuses on Aotearoa New Zealand place identity and placemaking, decolonising cities, and the design of educational space. She's got a huge commitment to how communities are using space and sharing space, and hopefully you've been lucky enough to listen to her interview on Radio New Zealand that we've posted up on the Facebook site. So I'd just like to hand over to you, Rebecca. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou katoa no ngā puhi me Ngāti Porou. I just wanted to thank Danielle for that really thoughtful presentation, and that work is really stimulating a whole lot of ideas about how to think about my own work. So thank you, Danielle. So I thought I would start by talking. I'm going to talk a little bit today about, and I'll try and do this quite quickly so that there's a bit of room for discussion. But I thought I would talk a bit about a project that we've been working on called Imagining Decolonised Cities. So I do have a slightly odd background, I guess. And I've actually just recently moved to the architecture school, so I am no longer in environmental studies. But having worked in an environmental geography type department and now moving into an architecture school, it's really kind of, I guess, signaled to me the different ways people think about space particularly, and the ways in which people understand power relationships in space. And unfortunately, many designers don't that well. So my work is particularly interested in the politics of space production, and how the kind of colonial project has it hasn't really created the kind of form that supports the way Māori whānau, iwi, hapu want to live lives. So if we could just go to the next slide. I thought I'd start by just reading out just a couple of paragraphs from a keynote speech by Ani Makaere. And I've given the link here for this document. So it's actually the proceedings of a hui that happened a few years ago, and there's a whole lot of amazing written chapters that speak to the idea of kaupapa Māori research. And partly I was looking up, people use kaupapa Māori research or decolonising research in ways that perhaps are quite tricky to understand sometimes. It seems quite a sort of esoteric term. So I was trying to sort of ground myself and think, well, what exactly does that mean? So I'll read a little bit, and then we'll explore that. Okay. So she says, during my early years as an academic, the racism and colonialism I encountered in the university system came as a shock. I had not realised that educated people were capable of being so ignorant. Our Pākehā colleagues saw no problem with conducting research on Māori, regarding as churlish our disinterest in their findings, and expecting universal acknowledgement as Indigenous experts. They appeared generally surprised when we rejected invitations to join their research teams on projects over which we had no control. That surprise, it should be added, rapidly turned to irritation and even anger when on occasion they required nominal Māori involvement to lend credibility to a research proposal, but found us uncooperative. They used their already well-established reputations to secure access to contestable funding, thereby cementing their own privileged positions as senior researchers, while denying opportunities to more junior colleagues to gain experience through the pursuit of their own research interests. The self-serving nature of the standard research practice, which demanded that any new project begin with a literature review, ensured that the work of these established researchers not only defined the parameters of new research, but also assumed an ever-increasing degree of authority each time it was referred to by later works. These people couched their writing, and even their conversation in some instances, in a language that was unintelligible to all but a select few. This effectively precluded the subjects of their research from making any comment on the value of their work, not that it occurred to them that the research subjects ought to have the opportunity to comment, and simultaneously bolstered their own sense of self-importance. I had never before seen language so expertly or blatantly wielded as a tool of self-elevation through the purposeful silencing and demeaning of others. So there's, if we could go to the next slide, there's a whole lot in there, and I can imagine that many Māori and Indigenous researchers across the world would see a lot of, would be nodding their heads in sort of support of Ani's words. And so I thought I'd just explore what I see as sort of 5 key ideas that she brings out there. And the first one bringing who should do research on with Māori or Indigenous communities, which is a hairy topic. Motivations for involving Māori researchers, or how do you use your research superpowers for good? The dangers of a literature review, so sort of harking back to the stuff that Danielle was talking about. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. The importance of testing interpretations of findings to kind of create research that has integrity in the views and the aspirations of the communities that you're working with, and the language of analysis and dissemination. Cool. So next slide, please. So who should do research on, and I'll put on in quotation marks to be a bit facetious, but or with Māori. So next slide, please. So I thought I'd use the project that we've been working on for a little while as a kind of a case study, I guess, to explore some of this. Who should do the work? And I often get this question from students. You know, who has the ability to do research with Māori, and hopefully not on Māori. And I guess one of the things we explored when we were doing this Imagining Decolonized Cities project, and if you're interested in more information, there's the website there, was what should our research team look like? Firstly, who's responsible for decolonisation? Is it just Māori or is it others? Who should lead such a project? And so on. So if we can go to the next slide. So this, in the end, was our research team. And so along the top, there's 3 women, Bianca, Jasmine and Jenny, and they were all I guess I would call them community researchers or iwi researchers. So they were all Ngāti Toa, because we were working on Ngāti Toa whenua or land. And then we had a kind of cross-disciplinary team of people from Māori studies, people from architecture, and people from geography, alongside a couple of students at the bottom, Tui and Chantal, who sort of supported the work, and that was really about building their capacity as well. So in the end, I led the project, and whilst some might say, oh, that's great, you know, this has to be a Māori-led project, which I absolutely think it did need to be. What would have been even better is if it was a Ngāti Toa-led project. So we acknowledge that, but there's a whole, as many of you will know, there's a whole lot of issues around time capacity of iwi members who are constantly being called on to do a whole lot of stuff, being consulted or hopefully engaged around a whole lot of issues. And so I led the project in the end. But we were also really careful to actually include Pākehā in our research process. So we were very careful that Māori led the project, but we were also mindful that the work of decolonisation can't just be the work of Māori. And in fact, the bulk of the work needs to be done in Pākehā circles. So we tried very hard to kind of create this sort of treaty relationship, both within the team. So we had, we still outnumbered our Pākehā colleagues, but there were 2 Pākehā academics involved, and we had a Pākehā student. But again, I think when you're doing something that's particularly Māori focused, it has to be weighted on the side of Māori voices. Next slide, please. And I guess that led me to think about the way that scholarship or research is thought about across the world, in universities, out in the community, that kind of thing. And I think I was sort of thinking about Max Weber's words where he makes this distinction between activist and academic. And these are his definitions: activists whose words are weapons, and academic whose words are ploughshares to loosen the soils of contemplative thought. A disinterested scholar, which seems to me to be a bit crap, really, and a sort of false distinction, where somehow we're meant to be these kind of, I can't imagine being disinterested in anything that I do in terms of research, because all research is political. It's political in terms of how you choose your research question. It's political in terms of who's involved. It's political in terms of who you engage with. Is it your whānau? Are you kind of elevating the voices, as Danielle's already talked about, of our kin and our wider tribal groups, or are you allowing kind of words of those who have had every privilege ever to continue to kind of pervade scholarship? So this idea of neutrality is obviously culturally loaded, and I think what it does do is it supports dominant theories like neoliberalism and so on, because they sort of easily come to the fore, and they disallow kind of alternative voices, shall I say. Okay, next slide. Hopefully this is not too simple 101 for you all, but bear with me and hopefully it's here. So relatedly, thinking about, what is the frame we look through, who are we, who are we in all this? And there's a really nice video, if you get time, from Dr. Paparangi Reid, where she's talking about privilege in relation to the researcher, the researched, and trying to move away from very superficial analyses of the reason why Māori have, high prison rates is because, they're bad people, as opposed to thinking, well, hold on, what are the sort of structural kind of underpinnings of colonialism, racism, and privilege and power that have meant that Māori find themselves in those positions? to be simplistic about it. Next slide, please. Okay, so second key idea, what are people's motivations? Like being very clear about motivations for being involved in Māori, or involving Māori researchers in projects, or even motivations for doing projects with Māori communities. I think it's super important that it's really clear from the outset why you'd want to do that. Next slide, please. So I'll go through this really quickly, but who's benefiting from the research? Is it you? It just reminds me of we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago about an Indigenous design group, and I won't name them, who is led by 2 white scholars. And they've developed a charter around Indigenous design, and they've noted their names at the bottom, sort of written by, George and Susie, or whatever their names are. And it just highlighted for me the fact that they had claimed authorship of a charter of Indigenous design as 2 white academics. The importance of understanding who benefits from your work and whether one should benefit from one's work. I remember a long time ago talking to Ngāhoia Taua Kōtuku about a book she had written in collaboration with a whole lot of her research. I'm going to use the word participants, although I take your point, Danielle, about that word, where she had essentially been the pen on the project, but she wanted to acknowledge the mātauranga, or the knowledge that was coming from her community, so she added a whole lot of people as her co-authors, and that's not very well recognised by the academic institutions that we sit in, unfortunately. Are you in it for the long haul? How do you see yourself developing relationships over the long term with the communities you're working in? And who should set research agendas? So again, I've heard academics like Professor Michelle Thompson-Fawcett talk, where she's said she tries really hard to be dictated by the community around what her research agenda should be. This is the complete antithesis to the way that most research happens, where we come up with this bright idea as this kind of amazing individual, and we say, okay, I'm going to do this. Okay, who can help me kind of get to my end point? So how do we kind of whakamana or empower the research community to set that agenda, and we kind of go along with that? Next slide, please. Oh, and just quickly, this sort of connects to ideas of Foucault's ideas about the inextricable link between power and knowledge, where he's talking about the fact that, a lot of kind of Western understandings of science and of knowledge production assume that there's sort of one way of thinking about the world, one truth, as opposed to there may be a whole range of different truths out there. Next slide, please. Oh, and this again feeds into that. So this is the idea that there's somehow this puzzle of understanding of knowledge, and we're sort of discovering one piece of it. And once we've done that bit, that's done now. There's no other, that's the truth, which I encounter quite a lot in the university. In fact, when I first started at Victoria, I remember being I was asked to give a talk about mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge and how it might be important for teaching and research. And I got up and I was sort of talking about, the importance of it in terms of kind of, acknowledging knowledge sets that students might be coming to university with, and da-da-da. And this one guy stood up and said, "Excuse me, but there are no other worldviews. There's only one type of science, because science is fundamentally true." So that's a very strongly held very strongly held tenet of a lot of, particularly the sciences, I have to say, which I think we need to combat. Next slide, please. So how do we use our research superpowers for good? Well, I would put at the top of the list the promotion of self-determination. You know, if all of our kind of research agenda is how are we supporting self-determination, then in some ways we can't go far from the right path or the right paths if we're understanding many right things. So, you know, collaborative and interactive approaches kind of, I think, push us along that right path. Understanding who has control, understanding whoever we are, whatever our backgrounds, we have to be accountable to the people that are involved in our research, accountable into the long term, not just, you know, after you've kind of written your research report. And thinking about methods, and again, Danielle did a spectacular example or range of examples of methods or methodologies which might be beneficial to Indigenous people that are not deficit producing. So I think there's long now been, well, at least in some circles, a move away from this kind of deficit approach to thinking, okay, what is the potential here? What is the creative and knowledge potential of Māori communities? Next slide, please. Oh, running out of time. Should I speed it up? Okay. So in our project, Imagining Decolonized Cities, thinking about methods, thinking about ways in which we might encourage self-determination, we drew on this idea of utopianism. So getting people to imagine what's possible and imagine hopeful possibilities. And that was partly about just sort of countering these Tina, there is no other alternative discourses that have come out of things like neoliberalism. And it was also about drawing on the creative collective imaginary to go beyond what we know already or what's possible or what's kind of existing. Next slide. So these were our aims. Next slide. Dangers of a literary review. Next slide. So yeah, I won't talk too much about this because I think Danielle's talked a lot, but I do think we need to be careful about literature reviews. They produce certain kind of results. We don't often critique who's writing, who the existing scholarship is coming from. I had a student the other day who wrote something about Indigenous design, and she'd put a whole lot of authors down, and 4 out of the 5 authors were actually non-Indigenous, and she had claimed them as Indigenous because of the type of stuff they were writing about, and because they had never positioned themselves in their writing. So are they Indigenous? Are they well-respected allies? Do they acknowledge their positionality? And who's funding the work? And if we kind of move from thinking about literature reviews as a thing to thinking about a conceptual or evaluative framework where a literature review might be just one kind of method, then I think that might be a kind of better framing. Next slide. Yeah, and so the way we tried to do this in our project was we drew on, we worked with mana whenua through a kind of wānanga process to try to develop a set of principles around mana whenua ideas and values. Next slide. So 4th idea, importance of testing interpretations of finding. Next slide. And I've just put up Pere's concepts, which I think are super crucial here. This whole process is around respect, face-to-face, kanohi, ki te kanohi, doing stuff in collaboration, making sure people retain dignity across these processes, sharing knowledge without arrogance, which is something that academics are not very good at, I have to say, and understanding what the rules are, the rules of the game. Next slide. And I think the way you do that well is, again, by having teams that are rooted in the places that you're working in, that have those people at the forefront of your research team, because then there's this constant negotiation of value. You know, what is worth producing, who should you produce it for, when should you produce it, and why should you produce it. And that's happening throughout the process, as opposed to kind of getting to the end and going, okay, we'll come back to you and say, okay, what do you want, you know, what do you want us to do next, kind of thing. Next slide. And this hopefully is a no-brainer, but relationships are crucial, and there's a whole lot of relationships that happen in research projects, and for us in our Imagining Decolonised Cities projects, they've really been at the heart of the success of that project. And, you know, in academic terms, it probably wasn't that successful at all. We've got no journal papers out of it. We've, you know, we haven't produced much in terms of written publications, but, you know, I now go out to dinner. We have a sort of kind of bi-monthly dinner with the women we work with on those projects, and we kind of continue to foster new ideas about where to next. Next project. Next thing. So just if you're interested, Aroha Hamid has a lovely video there about relationships. And finally, the language of analysis and dissemination. Next slide. So we thought quite carefully about, as I say, we didn't produce journal papers, but how do you disseminate work in a way that doesn't dumb it down, because people aren't stupid, but just makes it accessible, and, you know, and relevant to their lives and situations and what have you. So we're in the process of developing a board game called the Decoloniser, which is was actually one of the entries into our I didn't talk much about this, but we held a public urban design competition out in Porirua, where we kind of gathered a whole range of different ideas from different people, and this was one of the entries that didn't actually win, but we thought it was a really cool idea, and so we've started producing the game, or refining the game, and I just played it yesterday with a whole lot of architecture students down in Christchurch. And the whole thing is about sort of sparking conversations about what exactly is colonisation, and what is decolonisation, and trying to sort of decolonise a whole bit of land. We're still working on it, but it's actually proven at least successful in creating space for conversation. Next, I think that might be it. Oh, so yeah, so these are the sort of 5 key things that I think might be important to think about. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Rebecca. Wow, there's a power of ideas in there. I can see lots of interplay. Just reflecting on the fact that, you know, research is often such an extractive exercise for communities, and how do we really privilege their leadership in terms of these things. I think, you know, I'm coming up across a range of issues in terms of Indigenous evaluation and research versus partnered evaluation and research, and I think you raise a number of ideas about how to have those discussions about power. I was kind of thinking also about both of you talking about who is naming things, whose voices are coming through. Reminded me of Moana Jackson making a comment. I think he was talking about some philosopher who remarked that the namer of names is the father of all things, and how important it is to bring our own language to the work of community research. Just amazing. Yeah, I'm just blown away by you two. I think the contributions you're making to community are huge. We've got a couple of questions sitting here that I'd like for us to quickly go to, and we might finish a little, like 5 or 10 minutes after 12, just so we can get them answered. One is from Robin, who's interested in to hear how reciprocity is experienced in an Indigenous context, and if you feel that's different from a colonial worldview.
I think it's different from a colonial worldview, yes. You know, especially in relation to research, where, as you've mentioned, it's more extractive from communities rather than giving to and sharing with. And the way that you think about relationships become really important when you're talking about reciprocity because it's not about just that project, it's about the long-termness of that relationship, you know, and how it's not just about that moment of time, but that's going to go on, and how are you going to engage with that if it's going to be a relationship that's going to continue. And I think reciprocity happens through a lot of things beyond just the research process, but as I've mentioned, through the storytelling process, and also through time. For instance, you know, I get engaged with both as also as somebody who people want to work with, and having respectful amount of time to do the work respectfully together is part of that reciprocity, you know, making sure that you actually can do it respectfully and that's part of the decision-making process for me, as well as if I'm going to be involved in a project, can I do this in a respectful way, where we're going on a journey together and learning from each other, not taking and then going away and doing it. So I think that's yeah. What do you have to say, Becky, about reciprocity?
Sorry, I'm not very good at unmuting. Yeah, I think well, it's crucial. There's sort of no point doing research if it's not about reciprocity. And if you feel like if you feel this is different from a colonial worldview, yep. For the most part, yeah. I mean, yeah. I have nothing really extra to add. I think it's crucial.
I think one of the points that I recall from my peppered university education is in colonial kind of Western research, they often want to position the researcher as being very distanced from the research, whereas I think from Indigenous perspectives, we're the research along with the community. So, you know, I think it is quite different to, you know, traditional Western research expectations, and even the views that you expressed, Becky, in your discussion about your science lecturer, his positioning about truth. I think that really illustrates a response to that question as well. So we've got another question here from Cameron, and he's interested to hear from Danièle regarding the experience she had that impacted her PhD when she attended the museum.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So it was at a museum here in Sydney, and I was invited to go to a behind-the-scenes tour of some of the Indigenous objects. I didn't identify myself to the people running it. I just sort of walked in, and they had, I don't know if you can imagine if anyone's been to behind the scenes in the museum, but they have all of these massive shelves of objects, and they're all sort of just placed like a library almost, but on the shelves. And they had picked out some objects for us to look at. I think I was the only Aboriginal person there other than those who were guiding us around. And I normally, because I'm short, I come to the front of things to see what it is that I'm looking at, because otherwise I just don't see it. And I started to feel funny and started to feel like I needed to step backwards. And as this tour progressed, I noticed how these objects were being not only displayed on these racks, but also how they were being presented as objects. They had little tags on them, brown tags that as I mentioned, they when I was talking, they have the person who took the object or who found it or who dug it up, but not the name of the person who made it, or where they're from, or what their language group or any other identity information was. And if they didn't know that, which a lot of the time they didn't, they wrote unknown for that information. And I felt very sad about that, that was happening. But I also, as I was moving through this, started to feel very wonky and a bit like I was drunk. It's hard to explain that sort of experience, but it's a bit like I was drunk, and that I was starting to sort of float rather than walk. It was a really bizarre experience, and the only way I can explain it is that these objects were singing to me or speaking to me, and for some reason I was hearing it, and I was looking around and everyone else seemed okay. So I went up to the Aboriginal staff member and said, "Oh, sis, I don't know how you work in this place." And she said, "Oh, I should have checked if there was any Aboriginal people here, because this place can affect Aboriginal people." And she went on to describe it like an energetic process in which the objects still have a relationship to the people and the country from which they're made. And if you're a maker, you make things with your hands, and you know that you have a literal sharing of oils and of skin or whatever that comes off your skin and goes onto the objects, and vice versa. You get oils back on your skin from whatever you're making. And this is it for me as a weaver, where I'm using materials that come from country. And so also as an Aboriginal person, I believe I came from country, that I originated from this land. And so my DNA and my very essence comes from here. So when I'm talking about, I guess this is how I understand it, is that these objects still have some sort of relationality to me, which is why I could hear them speaking, and it was like 1,000 voices speaking it to me at once, which is why I was sort of getting spun out and going high, I guess. I asked to, took me all day to come down as well. I have to say I was out of it all day. It was a really surreal experience. And I then went and asked a few people who also do this sort of work, and elders, what that meant to them, what it meant. And I had one colleague who said that she'd had a very similar experience, and wasn't unusual. I had an elder who said he actually couldn't go into a museum. He had to rush out of a museum, and he couldn't go back in because of an object that he felt was communicating back to him. And then another elder who talked about energy and a process of energy exchange with objects. And my mum, who does understand things from a number of perspectives, but she also explained scientifically, and I can't explain science because I'm not a scientist, but she said there is a way of understanding this in relation to science. So this is why I went and talked to people about it, including the librarian, because I was like, this isn't okay, that these objects still have essences and relationships to people and places, and they might not be known at this instant where they're from, but they still have that relationship, and they're sitting there in museum shelves they're being cared for as objects that want to be, that they want to keep in that way, the temperature, etc. is right. But I think cultural care hasn't happened with those objects. And that means a whole lot of other way of caring. But also a lot of these objects were made to go back to country. And it's denying that responsibility they have. So it's a really hard experience to describe. So I hope I did it justice, but it's a very funny thing. But it did have huge impacts across my PhD and changed it substantially, including the referencing that I developed with Sophie Herbert, my friend and colleague.
Thank you, Danielle. Actually, when I was doing my Masters at Vic, we had a back-of-house tour with our Māori Masters group, and somebody in our group had a very similar experience to you, and we ended up sitting outside of the back-of-house tour because a lot of the things that you described were happening. I guess karakia is good for those things, but sometimes it might take something a bit more, and I think thinking about cultural care of those things is critical. Yeah, so thank you. Gosh, we've got some fabulous feedback from attendees who have really enjoyed today. I have a bunch of other questions, that we actually have run out of time for. I might post them up on the Facebook and make you both answer them anyway, if that's all right. I'd just like to remind all participants that if you're keen to subscribe to our webinar series, jump on our website, and our next seminar on the 14th of October will feature Tahu Kukatai and Kiri Kōwhai Makaere, helping us understand for our communities and community organisations what has gone on with Stats New Zealand. So it's going to be interesting. I'm very much looking forward to it. It's only a couple of weeks away, so please register for that. I'd also like to invite those who are able to attend our New and Emerging Researcher Awards in Wellington on the 31st of October. We have, hopefully, our awardees will be presenting a seminar in the afternoon. We're yet to determine who those are. And then we've got the awards evening that evening. So contact us via communications@communityresearch.org.nz to allow us to cater for numbers. And on behalf of Community Research, I'd like to offer our thanks to those who attended the webinar, to our wahine toa presenters, Danielle and Rebecca, ngā mihi nui ki a korua, for making time, sharing their work in our communities and pushing the boundaries of knowledge and impact to create space for different and Indigenous ways of knowing and being. To David Blair, our technician, thank you very much for your support in running the webinar today, and Jenny Moore, our kaimahi in the tari, for helping connect you all with the event via communications and a whole bunch of other back of house things. So, ka nui te mihi kia koutou katoa, hei ko nei rā. Kia ora.